Welcome to the IISS for this meeting on shifts and changes in India's foreign and security policy in Modi's first year. In his first year, Narendra Modi has been an energising force in Indian foreign policy. He's raised the country's profile. He was always a very active First Minister, even in Gujarat, very outgoing to raise trade profile. But since he's become Prime Minister, he's extended that, and the remit is not only trade promotion but also to raise India's profile generally. This is a subject that IISS is taking a keen interest in. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, my colleague, who's head of the South Asia program here, is about to embark on a major program of research on Indian foreign policy, for which this serves as something of a curtain raiser. Rahul.
Thank you very much, Nick. At the end of the first year of a government, there are invariably questions over whether its foreign and security policy will continue as in the past or change for the future. This is also the case in India, where the Modi government is about to complete 14 months in office. The Indian policy community is deeply divided over this issue. There are those who argue that Prime Minister Modi has already made fundamental changes to India's foreign policy. Some of these individuals are close to the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party-led government. Others argue the opposite, that there has been far more continuity, with any change being superficial so far. Some of these people are close to the opposition Congress Party. I would argue in the next 25 minutes that neither of these views are accurate. Whereas there is a large degree of continuity in foreign policy under Modi, there has also been one significant change, and I believe 6 key shifts in India's diplomacy. Whether these shifts will evolve further, if and how they will be implemented, and whether they will result in substantive changes to India's foreign policy are all too early to assess at the moment, with a near 4-year term of the Modi government remaining. Nonetheless, it is useful to take cognizance of these shifts and changes, as they provide an important framework for the future. But let me begin first with the elements of continuity in Modi's foreign policy in the last 14 months in relation to his predecessor government. Clearly, the core interests of any elected Indian government remain the same, namely domestic development and governance, as well as economic growth and investment. Therefore, a large degree of continuity in the fundamental objectives of India's foreign policy, which are essentially, I believe, to provide a stable, secure and peaceful neighborhood, to ensure inward foreign investment, and to seek an expansion of Indian influence, can be expected. Indeed, some of these aspects of continuity have been accelerated under the Modi government with a far greater degree of what I call ruthless pragmatism. We see this especially in Modi's greater focus on India's immediate neighborhood, on issues of inward investment, and in terms of India's relations with the United States. In just over a year, Modi visited all of India's immediate neighbors other than Pakistan and the Maldives, with the visit to the Maldives being cancelled. These visits served to revitalize India's relationships with the countries he visited. His bilateral visits to Nepal and Sri Lanka were the first by an Indian Prime Minister in decades. In Nepal, Modi offered to renegotiate the 1950 bilateral treaty, long considered by Nepal as unequal. In Sri Lanka, he signalled a new start to ties with the new Sirisena government, considered to be more responsive towards India than its predecessor. Modi's enthusiasm for regional engagement was demonstrated by his focus on SAARC, the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation. Modi is also eager, and this is the second part of the continuity in foreign policy terms, Modi is also eager to use foreign policy as a means to generate business and inward investment. Most of his foreign visits so far have sought resources, technology, and best practices from international partners. To the surprise of many, Modi also visited the United States within 4 months of becoming Prime Minister, despite having been denied a visa for 9 years. In January 2015, President Obama in January 2015 made his second state visit to India, becoming the first American chief guest at India's Republic Day parade. The Modi government also negotiated a deal with the US on trade facilitation and food security. At the same time, Modi revised some of the foreign policy positions that the BJP had taken while in opposition, deliberately in order to ensure that the continuation of foreign policy is there. Modi pushed hard for the implementation of the stalled 2008 US-India civil nuclear deal, reversing the BJP's previous position on this issue. This resulted in a breakthrough on the controversial civil nuclear liability issue and a deal on administrative arrangements to track nuclear material passing through prospective US-made reactors in India. For Bangladesh, Modi ensured the passage of a constitutional amendment within the Indian Parliament that resulted in the signing of a landmark boundary agreement during his visit to Dhaka, thereby reversing again BJP policy while in opposition. In terms of the second aspect, in terms of change of foreign policy, the most obvious change, I believe, has been in the style and optics of India's diplomacy. Modi's interactions with foreign leaders are highly personalized. We saw this through a welcome hug for President Obama on the airport tarmac in Delhi, which must have come as a surprise to Obama, I'm sure, and a selfie with Chinese Prime Minister Li in Beijing. Prime ministerial visits are today far more energetic than ever before, with multiple official engagements, including visits and speeches at universities and think tanks. New initiatives on foreign policy have been launched by the Modi government. Integrated tours of Central Asia, East Asia and the Indian Ocean have taken place at the level of the Prime Minister. The Ministry of External Affairs calls all this fast-track diplomacy. An American analyst calls it speed dating. Modi has also deliberately sought to connect with the Indian diaspora and the young on his visits abroad, unlike Indian leaders in the past, thereby receiving rock star-like adulation by Indian diaspora communities in the United States, Australia and Canada. In fact, I was struck once by the visual of a young Indian origin woman in Australia expressing excitement on television at receiving daily tweets from the Indian Prime Minister. And possibly this woman has never been to India before, but was so excited that every morning she would be receiving a tweet on her phone from the Indian Prime Minister's office. And that connectivity, I think, should not be underestimated. Modi also places far greater emphasis on India's cultural diplomacy, as shown by gifts of the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture, to foreign leaders, and the declaration of the first International Day of Yoga by the United Nations on the occasion of the summer solstice last month. All this, in fact, the optics, the style, has actually served to raise India's global profile in the last 14 months. And with Modi, especially perceived by the world and world leaders as a strong leader, unlike his predecessor, Dr. Manmohan Singh, this has also translated into a greater sense of self-confidence for India's diplomacy. So if that is the significant change in foreign policy, what are the substantive shifts that have taken place? And I believe there are 6 shifts that are currently underway in terms of foreign policy. But as I said earlier, the final result is still awaited. This will depend on implementation and other related aspects. But let's look at the first shift. The first shift, I believe, is that India now aspires to become a leading rather than just a balancing power. And this is important, and not just symbolically. In a speech at the IISS Asia office in Singapore earlier this week, India's Foreign Secretary, Dr. Jaishankar, who I'm delighted to add, introduced himself to the elite audience by saying that he was a IISS member, which he is, pointed to this shift. He went on to say, consequently, and let me quote him briefly on this. He said that India's aspiration to become a leading rather than a balancing power is seen in the following 2 or 3 ways. Firstly, for him, he sees a clear willingness for India to shoulder greater global responsibilities. And he went on to say that this was demonstrated recently in India's humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations in Yemen and Nepal. He added that this is also reflected in India's role in peacekeeping and in keeping the maritime commons safe and secure, and also finally by India's active participation in important global negotiations. In addition to what Jaishankar said, respected Indian policy analysts have attempted to further interpret these statements. And they have suggested that under Modi, India's foreign policy is seeking to leverage India's growing national capabilities to take on a greater global role instead of simply trying to limit Western or Chinese power. Accordingly, New Delhi appears to have abandoned, I believe, its position of non-alignment. Indeed, Modi skipped the April 2015 Asia-Africa Summit held in Indonesia, which marked the 60th anniversary of the Bandung Conference that led to the non-aligned movement. This shift in approach potentially provides for a stronger and a nationalist foreign policy. Yet, the final result in terms of the shift will essentially be dependent on the rate of India's economic growth and development, which has recently been strengthened with the fall in oil prices worldwide. With the government seeking to improve the business environment and business confidence upbeat on the prospect of major economic reforms that are still to be undertaken, India, with an expected 7.5% growth, is currently poised for the first time to overtake China as the fastest growing major economy this year. The second foreign policy shift, I believe, has been Modi's willingness to form a consensual front with the United States on Asia-Pacific security. During Obama's visit to India in January 2015, the two countries published a document that outlined their joint strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. It included a paragraph affirming the importance of safeguarding maritime security and ensuring freedom of navigation and overflight throughout the region, especially in the South China Sea. And the last as a part of the sentence is important, because in no other joint bilateral document with the United States would any previous government, and no previous government has, actually referred to China, because this has always been seen as an India-China relationship not involving a third party. So it's very significant that on two occasions, especially in this joint vision document, there was a clear allusion to China. The incorporation of the term South China Sea in this joint document has been widely perceived as implying that the two parties had reached a consensus on the need to counter Beijing's assertive approach to territorial disputes in the region. In essence, the joint vision recognized the complementary nature of Modi's Act East policy, focusing on Japan and Australia, and the US rebalance to Asia. A follow-on 10-year defense framework agreement has also now been signed with the United States. Trilateral cooperation among the US, Japan, and India has been raised for the first time to a foreign secretary level. Yet, while India and the US appear to be reaching a consensus on Asia-Pacific security, neither clearly wants a confrontational relationship with China. A quadrilateral naval exercise among India, the US, Japan, and Australia has therefore not been repeated for the past 7 years, since a stiff Chinese démarche had followed the first time this exercise took place a few years ago. So a key development will be in this area whether India, along with Australia, the US, and Japan and Singapore, finally agree to conduct another quadrilateral naval exercise. That will be the point, I think, where we could clearly conclude that the shift is becoming more than a shift and moving towards a change in that relationship. The third foreign policy shift under Modi has been to seek stronger trade and investment links with China, despite clear firmness in terms of bilateral political relations with China. India has granted e-visas to Chinese nationals despite problems over the issue of Chinese visas to Indians living in territory claimed by Beijing. Yet, when Chinese forces crossed the line of actual control at Chumar in September 2014 during a trip to India by President Xi, Modi responded in a robust manner. He sent reinforcements to the area and ensured that Indian troops held their positions. He also publicly expressed concern over the border dispute and raised Beijing's policies towards India's neighbors with the Chinese leadership. Subsequently, External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj added that Modi in Beijing had lodged a strong protest on the China-Pakistan economic corridor traversing Kashmiri territory claimed by India as being not acceptable to India. The joint statement issued at the end of Modi's May 2015 visit to China did not significantly contain references to maritime cooperation or to Asia-Pacific security, unlike a similar statement made several months earlier. Nor did the joint statement refer to China's One Belt, One Road initiative or the Maritime Silk Road, both of which India views with suspicion. While this may well be a shift that could be taking place, it is still not clear whether the policy dividends that India expects from this will actually fructify or not. And that again remains to be seen. The fourth shift has been the hardening of India's position towards Pakistan as relations between the two sides deteriorated. A meeting between the Pakistani High Commissioner in New Delhi and the leadership of the All Parties Hurriyat Conference in August 2014 had led to India's sudden cancellation of scheduled talks between the country's foreign secretaries. Talks that were expected to have restarted the formal dialogue between the two countries that had been stalled since January 2013. The worst border clashes between the two in the last decade broke out 2 months later, as India deliberately intensified violence across the line of control and the international boundary, the working border, with both sides blaming each other. There were deaths of civilians as well as troops in this firing and the clashes. There was also a distinct chill between Modi and his Pakistani counterpart Nawaz Sharif at the SAARC summit held in Kathmandu the following month, and a visit by the new Indian Foreign Secretary to Islamabad in March under the aegis of SAARC did not result in preliminary talks that were expected to have taken place. In April, a few weeks ago, New Delhi was angered by a Pakistani court's decision to release on bail Zakir Rahman Lakhvi, the operations chief of the Lashkar-e-Taiba militant group and the prime accused in the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks, after he had spent 6 years in a Pakistani prison. This discontent has been exacerbated by sharper rhetoric from officials on both sides. But in an encouraging move, Modi and his Pakistani counterpart Nawaz Sharif agreed earlier this month on the sidelines of a Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Russia to a diplomatic re-engagement on all outstanding issues, a diplomatic term which implicitly acknowledges the Kashmir dispute. This diplomatic re-engagement would be centered on a meeting between the two national security advisors to discuss what has been phrased as all issues connected to terrorism, which is another diplomatic phrase implicitly including state-sponsored and supported terrorism, followed by meetings of border force and military operations chiefs to stabilize the line of control and the international border, the working boundary. Modi at the same time also confirmed that he will be at the next SAARC meeting in Pakistan in late 2016. Unfortunately, this agreement between the two prime ministers was marred by an immediate spurt in cross-border firing across the line of control and the international working border, with each side blaming the other, as well as its subsequent differing interpretations of the joint statement by officials on both sides. Nonetheless, as of now, the meeting between the two national security advisors is expected to take place next month. The fifth shift and the penultimate shift I'll be talking about in terms of Modi's foreign policy has been a clear sense of seeking for India a proactive role in the Indian Ocean. Keeping aside the rhetoric, this is the first time that any Indian government actually perceives the Indian Ocean as part of India's immediate or extended neighborhood. Modi unveiled in March 2015 in Mauritius a strategy for the Indian Ocean, the first by an Indian Prime Minister in decades, which focused on three principal elements: defending India's maritime territory and interests, deepening economic and security cooperation with maritime neighbors, and promoting collective action for peace and security. Simultaneously, India seeks to raise its naval profile, build security links with the Indian Ocean island states, and significantly has agreed on investment and infrastructure development in islands of the Seychelles and Mauritius, which could be used by India for surveillance purposes in the central Indian Ocean. Yet, India's new Indian Ocean strategy cannot be met without a build-up of national requisite resources and capacities. India has only recently begun to build security relations with island states of the Indian Ocean. The Indian Navy's force levels and reach are still not sufficient for an expansive role in the Indian Ocean. This objective also requires extensive and durable cooperation with friendly regional and extra-regional navies in the Indian Ocean. The sixth and final shift in foreign policy is today the process towards abandonment of India's traditional support for the Palestinian cause in favor of Israel. New Delhi made clear that it would not take sides in the Gaza conflict that began in July 2014, urging peace talks between both Israel and Palestine. Although the Indian government subsequently voted against Israel at the UN Human Rights Council, thereby condemning Israel's disproportionate use of force, this was reportedly the decision of the Indian Foreign Ministry rather than that of the Prime Minister's office in India, which would have preferred, I believe, to have abstained from that vote. Nonetheless, Modi met Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in New York in September 2014 on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and the first visit ever of an Israeli defense minister to India took place in February this year, aiming to strengthen the country's security ties. In May, India abstained from voting on an application by a Palestinian non-governmental organization for special consultative status in a UN committee. A few days later, in early June, it was announced in Delhi that Modi would become the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel. Earlier this month, India also abstained on a UN HRC resolution condemning Israel over the same July 2014 UN report. Although this was reportedly due to technical, not political reasons, it was clearly in sharp contrast to India having voted in favor of anti-Israel resolutions in UN institutions in the past. Finally, to conclude, on a very separate note, what does all this mean for Modi's prospective visit to the United Kingdom in mid-November, the first by an Indian Prime Minister in a decade? Modi is India's first Prime Minister to be born after independence, so the baggage of any colonial legacy will not be present. The UK also played a lead role in the EU's outreach to Modi as early as October 2012, as well as the lifting of the EU travel ban on Modi. The key dimensions of this visit and the outcomes of the visit clearly are expected to be an outreach to the Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom, the seeking of skills, resources, technology, and best practices for manufacturing in India, and evolving a cooperative framework on South Asian security issues. Clearly a visit to watch. Thank you.
Rahul, thank you very much. We'll move now on to questions. If I could ask you please to state your name before you ask your question, and I'm going to call on one person, but then if those who would like to ask questions could raise their hands, I'll take the names. I saw you first, please, sir.
Thank you very much. Geoffrey Van Orden. I'm Conservative defence spokesman in the European Parliament. I also chair the delegation for relations with India, and I found your talk most useful and fascinating. Really two questions. You mentioned on the end the Modi visit to the UK. Given the fact that the United Kingdom is again becoming serious about defence, and by 2020 we will have a carrier strike force that's deployable, do you see a possibility of the United Kingdom becoming more involved in an alliance with India? You mentioned the Indian Ocean. Second point, the one country you didn't mention is Russia. And Russia historically, or recent historically, has been India's, if you like, most powerful ally, and continues to be the major supplier of military equipment to India. Where does the India-Russia relationship stand?
Sure, thank you, Jeffrey. I think there is potential in India-UK defence relationship. There have been one or two setbacks in the recent past on this, but there are two factors that become important. The first is that unlike the past, the Modi government is determined that it has unveiled a policy called Make in India, and it is determined that any major defence deal that goes through will be based on this Make in India aspect. So I think in terms of technology transfers, etc., the idea would be to ensure that there is a much greater sense of activity within the Indian setup rather than any other setup. That's one aspect that's important. The second is that there is competition on defence items for India in terms of the UK from other European countries. We've seen recently France. Today, the United States is the largest defense supplier to India, and that is because it has been able successfully, Boeing and others have been able to move forward on various acquisition programs on the P-8 and transport aircraft, etc. So there is competition that the UK will face in terms of these areas. But what you point to is a very important aspect, and that is the Indian Ocean and the maritime sort of link to that. It's an interesting idea to see how on carrier activity there could be some cooperation. The Americans have already moved forward on this, and when Ashton Carter was in Delhi early June, he signed a 10-year defense framework cooperative agreement, which is sort of continuation of the previous 10-year framework. But a key aspect of that was the United States being able to assist India on aircraft carrier technology. And that is what India is interested in. There were several other technology transfer agreements which were signed, but none of them have the same importance as this one. So I think clearly from what I've been saying about India's and Modi's interest, particularly on seeing the Indian Ocean as an immediate and extended neighborhood, I think carrier technology and related issues become important. On Russia, you're right. I should have mentioned Russia. And I think partly, I suppose, that there is nothing exciting or new or a change in the Russia relationship or a shift. We're seeing the every year a summit take place between the Indian Prime Minister and the Russian President. We're seeing a fairly relatively minimal levels of trade cooperation between India and Russia. Yes, in the last few weeks there has been some agreements on defense sales. In fact, 48 hours ago, there was a possible interest that the Russians were going to, for the first time, build naval frigates in an Indian private sector port, a dockyard in that sense, which has never been attempted before. But this fits very well into the Made in India structure that Modi is looking at. So I can expect that this will go ahead. So on the Russian side, nothing new in that sense. It will continue to be important, but there are far more. There's greater excitement on other relationships beyond Russia.
Okay, thank you. I have 9 people on my list. First one is Mark Fitzpatrick, please.
Thank you, Mark Fitzpatrick, Director of the Non-Proliferation and Program. Fascinating, really fascinating, these policy shifts. 2 questions, if I may. Are these part of an overarching strategy that's been enunciated as a Modi policy? I mean, I can see the relationships between these different shifts. Has the Prime Minister himself enunciated this? President. Secondly, the harder line toward Pakistan, one of the elements of this is a statement about taking action in Baluchistan in concert with non-state actors. This was seen as an admission in Pakistan. It was seen as an admission of Indian support for terrorist activities in Baluchistan. Do you see it that way?
Sure, Mark. I think in terms of the first question, there is no formal enunciated or public document or a doctrine that the Modi government has issued saying, these are the changes that we're looking at, these are the issues. These are my interpretations of what I've been seeing on the ground. So, in fact, I expect we will see something coming out, but at the moment there is nothing that is that one can point to and say this is the sort of this is government policy on these issues. What the government of India has brought out is something called fast-track diplomacy, or something they call it, which is basically a brochure of how many visits the Prime Minister has made abroad, etc. So, substantively, we have not yet seen anything official. What we have seen are occasional speeches that have taken place. So, Jaishankar speaking at IISS in Singapore earlier this week. We've seen other sort of ministers speak. But we've seen action. So we've seen a formal statement by Modi that he will be in Israel. We've seen in the UN the voting pattern. So nothing as yet formally, but at some stage I hope this will come out. In terms of Pakistan, yes, I mean there is a hardening of policy on the Indian side. The statement that I think you're referring to was the one by the Indian Defence Minister Manohar Parrikar, who said basically kaate se kaate nikalenge, which is we'll take out a thorn with a thorn. That's the Indian interpretation. So you take out a thorn with a thorn. That was what he was alluding to. But clearly the view was that if there are terror operations in India, then that is how one could deal with those operations. He then backtracked a bit and said he was misinterpreted in what he said. So essentially, the National Security Advisor then came on and said, well, actually, there are different ways of dealing with terrorism in India. And one of the ways is to ensure that you can deny terrorism by dealing with some of the groups that are behind the terror acts, as India has been doing in Kashmir for all these years, etc. There was no, as far as I'm aware, there was no clear reference to Balochistan at all in any of these statements. From the Indian side, at least, there wasn't. But on the Pakistani side, this was interpreted, as you said correctly, that this was basically the Indian Defence Minister formally enunciating a policy on counter-terrorism that was a very provocative policy. The Pakistan Defence Minister actually, suggested, in fact, said something very similar. The Pakistan National Security Advisor also brought out a note on these issues. My sense is that what is important now is really to see how the two countries are able to talk on these issues. And what is encouraging is that the meeting that will take place between the two countries will be led by the two national security advisors. On the Indian side, the Indian National Security Advisor has control over policy dealing with security issues, with terrorism, etc. And it's very interesting that these talks are not being conducted between the two foreign ministries, but on the Indian side at least by a security advisor to the Prime Minister. So it will be interesting to see what the format of these talks are, to see whether terrorism is, to see to what extent terrorism allegations by both sides are brought up, how they're dealt with. But we're entering a new territory. I mean, we've never had talks between NSAs ever before. So we're not sure how it will work out. But the fact that they will be meeting, we hope in August, itself is promising. But on the India-Pakistan relationship, never hold your breath on these things, as you know well, Mark.
Okay, gentleman at the back, please.
James Turing, Gazette, Institute of Commonwealth Studies and editor of Commonwealth and Comparative Politics. Thank you very much for a very illuminating and succinct review of the last 14 months. I have 2 points that I'd like to ask you about. The first is in relation to domestic policy and its implications for India's foreign policy. And especially on the controversies that have arisen over the treatment of foreign NGOs in India and the contributions made by foreign NGOs in India. And most notable of which was the action taken against the Ford Foundation. And the second is in relation to what appears to be a much harder policy against researchers, foreign researchers, including foreign researchers of Indian origin, working in India on sensitive subjects, including an Amnesty International person in Bangalore recently. Now, these kinds of measures could have an impact on India's image abroad and also its interaction with the wider interaction with foreign countries. So how far is the domestic policy in tune with the kind of dynamic openings that you have been talking about? The second point is in relation to the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth has not really figured very much in terms of Indian foreign policy for quite a long time. But a few years ago, India lobbied quite heavily to get an Indian appointed as Secretary General of the Commonwealth. But after that, appeared to take no further interest in the Commonwealth. So, does the Commonwealth, is it seen as a resource in terms of expanding India's foreign policy influence by the Modi government, or is it just not really thought of?
Thank you, James. There have been two well-publicized cases, as you know, in terms of amnesty and in terms of the Ford Foundation issue. In terms of the Ford Foundation, the Indian government views that this is a funding issue and there's concern over foreign funding of NGOs in India, and it is felt by this government that on issues of, say, nuclear power, for example, that the people protesting the potential construction of nuclear power plants or the operation of Russian nuclear reactors so far in India, have an agenda, and the agenda is an external agenda to prevent development in this area. So this government in the past, I think the government in the past has sort of managed this fairly effectively. It has allowed some element of opposition to take place in demonstrations against it. This government has a different view clearly on these issues, and my own sense is that there is extra sensitivity on these issues on the Indian side, on the Indian government side, but that may possibly be because this is a government that has a view of what it wants to do. It wants to move forward quickly. It doesn't want to see too much sort of domestic opposition to it. But I think I don't expect this to change any day. Really, there will be sensitivity on these issues, but that's just the mandate of and the ideology of this government. In terms of the Commonwealth, you're right. I mean, I think we can discuss later about the lobbying aspect and who was lobbying what at the time. But I think my sense is that we haven't seen anything publicly or even much interest on the Commonwealth from the Modi government side. So I'm just not sure how high it is in terms of priorities, because remember, for the Modi government, and it's important, sometimes we forget, these are people who've come into government, his senior policy advisor, the national security advisors, others, they're dealing with a whole lot of issues that they haven't dealt with. This is, after 10 years they're in office, so there are exciting things that they see. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, is one of them. BRICS, they want to move forward on that. So I think it's very important to see what the priorities are, because in many ways they can't deal with so many things at the same time. So it's very important, whether it's defense sales or foreign policy priority relations, to see what the competition is. And in the competitive environment of multilateral institutions, the Commonwealth, I think, is fairly low down the pecking order. And unless there is a clear sense, and I think this is what I refer to in my paper as, I believe the government's view is of ruthless pragmatism on these issues. When I deal with the Indian government and say, well, this is what we have done with the Indian government in the past, the response is, listen, forget the precedent. We don't want to know that. You tell us, how we can sort of, you can benefit, we can benefit. It's a very pragmatic way of doing things. And they don't want to talk about the past, but they want to move into the future. So I would say it's really a question of what the Commonwealth is able to seek to deliver for India, and it's sort of its attempt at seeking a global role. That will be the fundamental decision making process on this, and nothing else.
Thank you. We have 9 questions left and less than 20 minutes, so brevity is the soul of wit, and that applies to the answerer as well as asking the question.
Sure.
You, sir, please.
Vinod Kumar, member of this institute. You refer that India had formally abolished non-alignment because now they are going to be looking after more national interests. Well, there are 2 aspects to this question actually. One is, as I had understood, non-alignment always retained the right for strategic autonomy. That was a key concept underpinning non-alignment. So therefore, that did not mean abandoning looking after national interests, however it was interpreted. That's the one aspect of the question. The other is, you said that by signing this joint Indo-US vision on Asia-Pacific, strategic vision, India was now complementing American policy in Asia-Pacific region. Given that the Asian pivot was announced by the US a few years earlier, and that was widely interpreted by US and Western and other commentators as objective containing China, notwithstanding the formal statement they are not about to contain China, does this mean, what are its implications for Indian foreign policy if they are complementing? Because does this mean, for example, not only they have downgraded improving relations with Pakistan, but does it also mean downgrading improving relations with China in political border issue and other political matters as distinct from business? Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. I said that, as you rightly said, I mean, in terms of non-alignment, that I think this concept is over for the Modi government. They're not interested in non-alignment. And the way that they see it is that non-alignment actually was constraining. It was constraining because it was basically a negative concept. You were sort of saying, well, let's not improve relations. No, but fair enough. But it was one where we were looking at the superpowers, and basically in the current context saying, okay, let's ensure that we keep away from the United States, we keep away from China. What Modi's foreign policy, I think, is seeking to do is saying, well, listen, that was a balancing power. That was a balancing role that India was trying to do. What it wants to do is be a leading power. The aspiration, as I said in the paper, is to be a leading power. That has different connotation. And the connotation is 2 things, I think. One, a far more proactive rather than a reactive policy. That's very important. Because in a way, the non-aligned concept was actually reactive. I mean, you don't have options to branch out in different ways, because all you were doing was saying, well, we've got to make sure that you're equidistant from both. The concept of a leading power is a much more proactive, ideally a less responsive aspect. That's one. The second, I think, is that it provides a lot of opportunities, a lot of options in this. So there is no way that India is going to give up its autonomy or have an alliance partnership with any country. But it provides incentives to move forward in other relationships. And one relationship that I mentioned, which I think is going to be increasingly important, is the one with Israel. And that actually fits in well with the sort of the new framework that it's looking at. In terms of the of what I said that there's a consensus emerging between India and the US on Asia-Pacific security. And we saw that by the use of the term South China Sea in the document. I also said that it's not that there is going to be that India is looking at a confrontational relationship with China, but again, it is something that no government in the past, Indian government in the past, would have put in a bilateral statement with a third country. So it shows the shifts. that actually this government is taking, a far more bolder approach towards China on political issues. It has taken, in terms of talking to the Chinese leadership, a number of concerns that it has than any government in the past. But at the same time, it wants to build the technology investment relationship with China. And the question for me, as I said, was, will this work? The Indian government may want to have it both ways, that you get the investment, get the technology for infrastructure, etc., but then also you have a sharper position towards China. We still have to see whether it will work. What is interesting is that in the joint statement when Modi was in China, had no reference to maritime security, to Asia-Pacific issues, for the simple reason that once the Chinese saw the joint statement with India and the US, clearly there was no interest in doing this. So those are the changes, the shifts that are taking place, which I think provide a consensus and opportunities for something more, but not to the extent that we're going to look at military alliances. If there is a quadrilateral naval exercise, that'll be a big step forward.
Right. Thank you.
Desmond Bowen, please.
Desmond Bowen, Homer. Rahul, thanks very much, and it's really interesting to see how you've perceived and pulled together a significant shift in foreign policy. And I've got a question which is about, this is clearly Modi-led, and it's a Modi government above all. What's the sense of the opposition? And I know that the opposition sort of barely exists, but is this a abiding shift, or is it likely to be something that lasts while Modi is there, and then India will revert to type? We can't see into the future completely, but I think there's a real sort of sense of, is this a real shift that is affecting the leading lights in the establishment of India, and Modi is taking people with him as he goes on this new path?
Thank you, Desmond. That's a great question. And in terms of foreign policy, the Prime Minister of India has much greater leeway than domestic policy when it comes to the opposition. So what we've seen in the last 14 months is that domestically, whereas Modi may have a majority in the lower house of parliament, there are key economic reforms that are stuck because he doesn't have, the coalition party, ruling party, doesn't have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, for example, that the BJP actually controls fewer than half of India's total states within the country. But that's all the domestic issues. On foreign policy issues, there's a much larger mandate for him and a more effective platform for him to move forward. And in the foreign policy sphere, we don't see any serious opposition that actually matters. So, of course, the Congress party has visibly demonstrated against what the shift I was talking about in terms of India's policy towards Israel. There have been statements saying that that how can Modi do this, etc. Why is India voting the way it has voted recently in the UN, etc. There are concerns over the Pakistan policy by the Congress, saying that there are various U-turns of the Modi government, but actually it doesn't matter because he doesn't, with the rare exception of the Bangladesh case, when he actually had to get a constitutional amendment to move forward on the land boundary agreement. On other issues of foreign policy, he can move forward without actually going back to the House of Parliament on most decisions. So my sense is that these shifts, as long as Modi has the majority, as long as there isn't the political opposition that is effective in any way, these shifts will continue. I don't see any going back on these. And what is interesting is that very often in the Indian government cases, it's always the first year that in many ways determines what the Prime Minister's foreign policy agenda is, rather than the next few years when it's mainly implementation. So my sense is that these shifts will continue. There is no going back. The question I have, of course, is the degree of implementation of this, for example, and that's a big question. Will they be implemented effectively? How will India's foreign and security establishment move forward on these issues? Are there enough resources to build on this? Those are big questions that have to be answered. But they are not questions that are political questions, really.
Yes, please.
I, as member Vipul Thakur, I have a brief comment only on the economy. There was a very recent article this week in Financial Times, second coming of Bangalore. So, of course, it has been known for outsourcing and all that. Indian outsourcing exports are around $100 billion now. But then there are a large number of startups and high-tech companies which are coming up. And I think there are three things that's going to really shoot up India in this field. Point number two, Make in India is also taking off very strongly, and I've noted about 20 significant projects which are in the pipeline. Of course, it will take about 2-3 years to show the results, increasing industrial production, etc., and exports. Just two brief examples. One is Honda is making India a global hub for small cars, and Volvo is going to export India-made buses to Europe within 2 years, according to European standards. Three, India's working very hard, especially the Prime Minister Modi, maybe behind the scene, to increase aerospace capabilities exports, like launching satellites for different countries. And I think he's probably using this as something that India needs and demands. Recently, Indian ISRO put in space 5 satellites for a British company in space using one rocket. That was about 3 weeks back. And fourth, I expect India's GDP growth to be over 8% in the next fiscal year, and assisted by the fact that India is saving about US $45 billion a year because of reduced oil prices. Thank you.
No comment.
Nicholas McLean, please.
There seems to be a very close personal affinity between Abe and Modi. But what does that mean in real terms? Both prime ministers are facing intractable problems of structural reform. Can they help each other in any way? And on the East China Sea, to what extent can Modi give some support?
Yeah, I mean, there's Japan was the first sort of non-South Asia destination of travel for Modi bilaterally. So Japan was the first country. The relationship is strong between Abe and Modi, and Abe in India actually. When Abe was Prime Minister earlier, he came to Delhi and addressed the Joint House of Parliament, etc. But in terms of the structural issues, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. But in terms of the East Asia environment, East China Sea, you said, my own sense is that there is a lot of rhetoric on this from the Indian side, but I think realistically, it is the Indian Ocean where the priority is. India doesn't have any clear, I mean, the East China Sea especially, there aren't any clear sort of strategic objectives for India, and I think in many ways, in terms of trade, etc., the security of passage, the Indian Ocean becomes far more important. So my own view is that the East China Sea it may well serve a diplomatic purpose, on the South China Sea particularly as the sense, but I don't think there's going to be any operational aspect for India on the East China Sea.
Okay, coming back, yes please.
My name is Pavel from Sunday, I'm a research director Centre. Could I ask about India's long-standing bid for a permanent seat at the Security Council, and whether you think that this fits under your first shift on India seeking to be a leading global balancing power?
I think India's, sort of case for a permanent, for an expansion, clearly of the UN Security Council first, and then the membership, has gone through several years. I mean, it's a case that India's formed various alliances with countries, etc., to push forward on this. There is clearly interest in this. But I think one has to be careful to see, the level of interest and the level of expectation on this. How realistically it will be, and very often countries of the P5, have at least most of the countries of the P5 have supported India's quest for membership of an expanded UN Security Council. But India, India is realistic enough to know that that's not sufficient unless there is a very clear sense of of an effective group looking at expansion of the UN Security Council, its case is not going to be heard effectively and will not become a member. So I think it's very important to keep the rhetoric away from the reality. Rhetoric, yes, the interest will be there, but I think reality will be, can countries of the P5 actually effectively work together to try to see that there is some effective move towards an expansion of the UN Security Council or not? And that's important. But unless that happens, I think, yes, it's an aspiration, but realistically, it's very difficult to happen. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Zahid Hussain. I'm a journalist. Rahul, about the fifth shift, you have mentioned about Pakistan hardening the position in Pakistan. But at the same time, we saw something breaking of ice, and the initiative came from India for this UFA sideline talks. What led to this change? First, it was from no engagement to re-engagement with Pakistan, quite significant that way. Obviously, it's also very significant, as you mentioned, that for the first time the talks are taking place on the national security and levels. And what is the real significance of that? The other issue is how serious is the concern of India on Pakistan-China economic corridor, and how it's going to have an impact. The third thing about Afghanistan, there was no mention of Afghanistan, and certainly in the past we have seen a lot of interest from India. And there's also at one point there was a clear position on the no talk with Taliban and others. But they're changing situation. How does India see the issue of Afghanistan and vis-a-vis relations with Pakistan?
Okay, well, very briefly, because there are three big questions. But I think I'm also trying to understand what happened on the Indian side on UFA. But my sense is that when Modi was sworn in, he was very clear. And this is personal in the sense from Modi's side that he wanted to engage with Pakistan, and this was before the formal government establishment had taken place, before the National Security Advisor had been appointed, and there was an outreach to Pakistan through SAARC in that sense. So the question of inviting SAARC heads of government to the inauguration ceremony in Delhi. So the outreach was there right from the beginning. Then, of course, the idea was that the foreign secretaries would meet, and that meeting, as I mentioned, didn't take place because of the meeting with the Hurriyat, the Pakistan High Commissioner. Over the last few months, actually, the relationship has deteriorated clearly in terms of firing, in terms of allegations, counter-allegations, etc. My sense, is from the outside is that there is an interest. There are two levels. One level is that that the region, the neighborhood, is far more important to this government than before. So it's important to ensure that there is stability in the neighborhood, and it is important for the stability to engage with Pakistan. So at one level, I think there was a view that it's not going to be possible to not engage with Pakistan, but the timing has to be right. There was a phone call just before Ramazan when Prime Minister Modi spoke to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, and reportedly that is when they decided to meet at UFA. So at one level it is that stability is required and engagement with Pakistan is there. At another level, I think it is also clear that this government is keen to move forward on a number of SAARC-based initiatives. I've often sort of asked, what is it about SAARC that Modi likes so much? And compared to other prime ministers, but there's something about SAARC. I mean, he likes the sort of regional connectivity concepts, etc. And I think that may be another reason where you have a situation where SAARC is going to host the next summit. Pakistan is hosting the next summit, the SAARC summit in Islamabad. Modi sees regional connectivity as important: energy, electricity, power, transportation, and Pakistan becomes part of that, or at least an attempt to bring Pakistan into that. In terms of Afghanistan, we do a lot of work at the Institute on Afghanistan issues, etc. But I said that the headline, I think, is that there is concern in Delhi over the outreach that President Ghani has towards Islamabad in the last few months. We saw President Ghani arrive in Delhi several months after he became president. But I think the Indian view is that, well, actually, what is important is the stability of Afghanistan. I mean, if that relationship, the burgeoning Kabul-Islamabad relationship is able to provide stability to Afghanistan, then that's good, because stability in Afghanistan helps India, and that is what India is looking for. There is concern, of course, in terms of the nature or the framework of such a stability. But I think on the Indian side, there is a reality, and that is that Pakistan is the immediate neighbor of Afghanistan. India is not. India has no land access to Afghanistan. Pakistan is not providing the transit aspect. So at one level, there's a very clear sense of realism here. Pragmatism again, I think, which I talked about again, a sense of pragmatism, how to deal with foreign relations. In terms of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the concern on the Indian side, when we saw that from Sushma Swaraj's statement, was over issues of Pakistan-administered Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan, a view that Chinese projects, Chinese money would flow in that. So I think from the Indian side, there is a view that it makes it difficult in terms of the status of Kashmir, between the two countries. But this has been interpreted by others as saying, well, India is out to sort of make sure that doesn't work, etc. I think that is an exaggeration on it.
Thank you. Well, we've had our hour, and I'm afraid a generous portion of Ferguson time, so I'm going to have to bring matters to a close here. I'm sorry, but those of you who do have questions can approach Rahul at the end. Thank you all very much for coming, for your questions, but please join me in thanking Rahul.